Good evening. It is a very special pleasure for me to have this opportunity to introduce the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award in U.S. China Relations, which will be conferred on former Secretary of Commerce, Barbara Hackman Franklin. I have been a friend and admirer of Secretary Franklin for nearly 25 years. As the 29th Secretary of Commerce under President George Herbert Walker Bush, she led a presidential mission to Beijing in December of 1992 at a time when I was the U.S. ambassador there. Beijing was a lonely place for American diplomats in those days. For nearly 3 years, the U.S. government had banned high-level government-to-government contacts with China, the sole exception being the contentious visit of Secretary of State James Baker to Beijing in November of 1991. A few months before her visit, President Bush, in an effort to facilitate his re-election in the presidential elections in November 1992, had made the decision to sell F-16 fighter planes to Taiwan, a move that China considered a violation of the August 17, 1982 joint communique between China and the United States. It is fair to say that this was not the high point in U.S. China relations. In any event, President Bush's move failed. He was not re-elected. Bill Clinton won the presidential election, and he had been, as a candidate, highly critical of China, comparing Beijing to Baghdad. I find the only similarity between Beijing and Baghdad is that both names begin with a B. In any event, this cast dark clouds over the outlook for U.S. China relations. Against this background, President Bush decided to resume high-level economic talks with the Chinese, and he asked Secretary Franklin to take on this task, which she did with enthusiasm and perhaps an element of trepidation. Together with her counterpart, Minister Li Lanqing, Secretary Franklin reconvened the 7th session of the U.S. PRC Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, which had been suspended since 1989. Her visit helped finalize nearly $1 billion in signed contracts for U.S. businesses and paved the way for the explosion of U.S. trade and investment with China that began in 1993. Reflecting the recognition by the American business community that China was firmly back on the path of reform and openness. Throughout her visit, Secretary Franklin conducted herself with skill, courtesy, and professionalism, demonstrating that she had immersed herself in the details of the U.S.-China economic relationship. I was greatly impressed. That visit alone, in my prejudiced opinion, would justify this Lifetime Achievement Award and 1,000 more like it. The reality, however, is that for Secretary Franklin, this was simply another significant accomplishment in a lifetime of extraordinary achievement. When she graduated from high school in her hometown in Pennsylvania, she was the class valedictorian, the president of the student council, captain of the field hockey and tennis teams, and a cheerleader, a role she could still perform with distinction today, but not tonight. On graduation from college, she became one of the first women to be admitted to Harvard Business School at a time when women constituted 2% of the entering class to the Harvard Business School. She graduated 2 years later with an MBA and then spent several years working in the corporate world before President Nixon recruited her to fill a position aimed at bringing more women into high-level policy-making government positions. In her first year alone, she tripled the number of women placed into policy-making positions in the Nixon administration from 36 to 105. She created a talent bank of 1,000 qualified women for future openings, and more than half of the positions that were filled by women under the program that Secretary Franklin was promoting had never been held before by a woman. The numbers expanded out to include many positions long closed to women, such as sky marshals, tugboat captains, FBI agents, and forest rangers. It was in this environment that the U.S. military, for the first time, began to promote women to become generals and admirals. These accomplishments led President Nixon to nominate her as one of the first of 5 original commissioners of the Consumer Product Safety Board. She went on to serve in a variety of other government commissions before becoming Secretary of Commerce under President George Herbert Walker Bush. She was the most senior woman in the Bush administration, and she was only the 13th woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States. After serving 5 U.S. presidents with distinction, Secretary Franklin was in high demand to join the boards of major U.S. corporations, and before you know it, she was cited by the American Management Association as one of the 50 most influential corporate directors in the United States. I cite these facts to illustrate that she deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award in many different fields and not simply in U.S. China Relations, but I am greatly honored, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Secretary Franklin to the podium. This is a Lifetime Achievement Award in U.S. China Relations presented to the Honorable Barbara Hackman Franklin by the U.S. China Policy Foundation, November 17, 2016. Barbara, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Stanley. That was just perfectly wonderful. I'm going to give you another hug. Oh, so we just dropped the plaque.
You hold it for a photo. Yes.
Oh,
Here we go.
sorry, we're messing up here.
You want to say a few words?
Yeah.
You want me to-
Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you. I'm breathlessly overwhelmed, Ambassador Roy. That was incredibly generous, and I thank you very much. And I have to say to you that you are a star in the firmament of U.S. China relations for your insight and wisdom over many years, and your career in the ambassadorial roles you've held. And I will always be grateful to the assistance you gave me during that mission in 1992. It was absolutely invaluable. I'm eternally grateful. And I do want to salute my old friend, Dr. Wang Chi, and Ernestine, and this foundation, and the wonderful work that you have been doing all these years to build many different kinds of bridges throughout both societies. It's really important work, and it really counts. Thank you. And of course, the great Mike Lambton. Mike you're wonderfully eloquent as usual tonight, but Mike, to me, could get any number of lifetime awards for building the U.S. China relationship. You're one of my heroes in that whole arena. And of course, I'm honored to be here with the Secretary General or his representative to have the same kind of award, or his is a different award, but to be in the same arena with him. And of course, Ambassador Tsui, always a pleasure to see you. I want to thank my wonderful husband, Wally Barnes, who's over here and who has been so supportive over the years of my China work. Thank you, Wally. Well, in coming here, and of course, Stapleton Roy started this, I wanted to turn the clock back in my memory to 1992, the week after the election. And of course, as he told you, President George H.W. Bush had lost. The President called me and asked me to undertake a mission to China. I was surprised, I have to admit. The reason, of course, is because U.S. China relations were at such a low point and had been since the events at Tiananmen Square in 1989 and the 8 sanctions that the U.S. had placed on China. And there had been some very tough rhetoric aimed both at China and President Bush during that 1992 campaign. But the President explained that he wanted one of those sanctions removed, the ban on high-level government-to-government contact, because, he said, it would be more difficult for the new administration to build the relationship with China if that sanction were still in place. So, I was to go to Beijing and reconvene with my counterpart, the U.S. China Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, JCCT. And as Stape said, it had been moribund since 1989 because of that high-level contact ban. Doing that, reconvening JCCT, would signal a normalizing of commercial relationships between China and the U.S., and that was a quite insignificant situation back then. And it would bring the entire Sino-U.S. relationship into hopefully a better place. So the purpose of that mission was clear. Time was of the essence. The Bush administration would leave, we would all leave in January. It was now mid-November. So we did what we had to do. We put a delegation together, a small one as these things really go to now, and we prepared like mad for this trip. Now the Commerce Secretary, as you may know, does not have an aircraft. Secretary of State does, for example, and so do some others, not the Commerce Secretary. So the President made available to me, so that I could go in style to Beijing, an old Boeing 707. Now that plane was so old that it was not equipped with a GPS. The pilots were using handheld GPSs to fly that aircraft, and I learned that afterward from my husband, who is a pilot, and I can only say I'm glad I didn't know any of it while we were on the road to Beijing and back. Anyway, we did not make a lot of public announcements about this trip, but the word, of course, got out. And that brought out some negative feelings about China that were prevalent at the time. From the right side of the political spectrum, Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina, if any of you remember him, called me and said, "You should not go. They are communists, and we should not engage with them." And then from the left, there were those who were very concerned about human rights and were angry with China. So at the outset, given that situation, this mission was bound to be controversial. And quite frankly, it was. Now, I was also mindful that there was a diplomatic aspect to this trip, but that I was not the Secretary of State, I was the Secretary of Commerce, and I had better develop some business for U.S. companies. And so I sent messages to our Chinese counterparts before we left about the new business relationships I hope we could form while we were there that would be a win-win for both sides. We left Washington in mid-December, arrived in Beijing, had very productive meetings with the Chinese side, led by Minister Li Lanqing, whom I liked very much, and we worked quite well together. I had a cordial meeting with Premier Li Peng. And the result, as Ambassador Roy has told you, about $1 billion worth of contracts were signed between U.S. and Chinese companies while we were there. Now that sounds like not much today, but back then, that was a nice, healthy amount. And more business flowed afterwards, and the JCCT working groups got going again. Well, then we came home. I wrote a report to the President and the Congress, and we left office. And that was that. Only in hindsight, years later, did the significance of that mission come into full view, at least for me. It was a turning point that began to get a productive relationship between the two countries back on track. It gave a green light to U.S. companies eager to explore business opportunities in China, and they did. And the trajectory of trade and direct foreign investment really took off after that. So now, here we are today, 24 years later, and the economic relationship is so large, so complex, so multifaceted, so interdependent, and so very critical to both sides and to the global community. Today, it's the very foundation of the U.S. China relationship, which is the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. And it's really rather amazing when you think back, despite the rough spots in all these years, and the differences we have, and we do have some differences, great progress has been made working together. So the relationship between our two countries is vastly different and much more positive today than it was in 1992. And that's something we shouldn't forget. Now, this election here is over, and a new government is in formation. It's a hopeful sign that President-elect Trump and President Xi Jinping have talked, and from the sound of it, have expressed a willingness to work together. My further hope is that the two presidents will talk regularly and often, that they will build a personal relationship, that they will identify areas of agreement where the two countries can work together and do that, both for the short term and the long term, and that they will also identify areas of disagreement and look for some common ground there too. My hope is that our new president will appoint people who understand and have experience with China, and that on the Chinese side there will be an equal desire to work with the U.S. counterparts. And finally, for those of us here in this room, we all have friends and colleagues on the U.S. side, on the Chinese side, or both. So as this new government takes shape here, and as there are perhaps changes in China next year, now is a time to motivate ourselves and our friends and colleagues to do whatever all of us can do to help this relationship between the two countries move forward in a positive way. I'd like to think that we would all leave here tonight with a determination that we will do just that. Thank you so much for honoring me. This means a lot.